Okay, so let's move on to some climate change news. Now that I got my buttons back, I'm sure a lot of people have seen this floating around the interwebs, and this is very frightening. From Gavin Schmidt, courtesy of Jeff Baradelli. Time to update our information. The Arctic is no longer warming at twice the rate of the globe. It's now closer to 3 times. Yeah. 3 times the rate of warming. So here's the global mean over the years. Here's where we are now. Here is the Arctic. And this is where the Arctic is at. So the rate of warming, and again, it's the rate of change, which is the scary part of climate change. So, yeah, the rate of change in the Arctic is 3 times. Let's move on to something from Zach Labe. This is the 12-month running mean global temperature anomaly. It is tied for the warmest on record with 2016 in Era 5 data. Let's look at this graph. Global temperature, 12-month running mean, and here we are here. Remember that 2016 was an El Nino year, and we are not in an El Nino year. So add that to the isn't this frightening list. More on Arctic warming. This is from Jill. I always like when I find a scientist who tells the truth about what's going on in this field. From Antti Lipponen. Again, 3.8 times faster than the global mean. So that's actually almost 4 times faster. Can we look at this any closer? I don't know. We can do that. So this is this is from 1951. I don't know. Again, the global mean versus the Arctic mean. During the last 30 years, so over the last 30 years, the Arctic has been warming more than 3.8 times faster. So more than 3.8 is that, can we call that 4? What shall we call that? Moving on, flooding still affecting South China. This is from yesterday. Heavy rainstorms persist in South China as flooding wreaks havoc. As waves of devastating floods sweep across southern China, buildings have collapsed, bridges have begun to show cracks, roads have been left inoperative. Long Kuijiao, a resident in Guangxi province's Lipu city, can't shake off the memory of seeing her house collapse. Long was standing on the rooftop of her apartment with her son on the back when the flood came roaring through her entire community. As the buildings surrounding her came crashing down, Long began to also hear the sound of cracking from her own home and realized their lives were under imminent threat. About 495,000 people have been dislocated, and at least 39 people have either died or gone unaccounted for. Some 8.5 million have been affected to a certain extent. A number of counties in Guangdong province have also been engulfed by flood, with houses left underwater and people stranded. Bamboo rafts have become the main transport vehicle. They were deployed en masse for rescue workers to move across counties, evacuating residents and distributing essential supplies. Landlocked southwestern Guizhou province and Chongqing municipality were among the worst hit. The hundreds of thousands displaced, but with few casualties. And again, that the flood devastation in China is continuing. Let's move on to this is an interesting story from this is from Energy Skeptic, and I'm skeptical about anything that has the word skeptic in it, as in website, publication, Twitter handle, whatever, but we'll just go with this for now. Global oil discovered 7.7 times less than consumption in 2019. So this is an interesting. Interesting bit of information. So there's less oil being discovered than being used. Of course, we know that we are in a peak oil scenario. The global conventional discovery chart above lists natural gas and oil discoveries since 2013. The fossil fuel that really matters is oil, since it's the master resource that makes all others available, including natural gas, coal, transportation, and manufacturing. As you can see, in 2019, the world burned 7.7 times more oil than was discovered. 7.7 times, with a shortfall of 31.74 million barrels of oil to be discovered to break even in the future. This can't end well, as anyone whose COVID-19 pantry is emptying can easily grasp. From Peak Oil Review, February 10th, 2020, worldwide production of oil was 60.27% sourced from conventional onshore oil, 21.59% conventional offshore shallow water oil, 8.1% conventional offshore deep water, 6.93% U.S. tight oil fracking, and 3.1% Canadian oil sands oil extraction. And here's another good chart. Oil discoveries lowest since 1947. Explorers in 2015 discovered only about a tenth as much oil as they have annually on average since 1960. This year, they'll probably find even less, spurring new fears about their ability to meet future demand. With oil prices down by more than half since the price collapsed 2 years ago, drillers have cut their exploration budgets to the bone. The result, just 2.7 billion barrels of new supply was discovered in 2015, the smallest amount since 1947. Well, there's actually been, obviously we're in an oil glut at the moment because of the pandemic. But long term, obviously, this spells the end of a fossil fuel based industrial civilization. Oil companies will need to invest about $1 trillion a year to continue to meet demand. Wow. Supposedly a significant supply gap may open up by 2040. You don't say. That's not far away. I mean, if you think everything's going to continue to operate as normal for the next 20 years, then you might be okay with it coming in 20 years. I don't know. Overall, the proportion of new oil that the industry has added to offset the amount it pumps has dropped from 30% in 2013 to a reserve replacement ratio of just 6% this year in terms of conventional resources, which excludes shale oil and gas. ExxonMobil Corp said in February that it failed to replace at least 100% of its production by adding resources with new finds or acquisitions for the first time in 22 years. That's a scary thing because seriously, there's no exploration going on today. The CEO of offshore drilling company Seadrill. Oh, that's a catchy name right there. Some super brainiac thought that one up. Yeah, so what, obviously demand for oil is still going up. At the moment, though, because of the pandemic, we have an oil glut. However, in the future, or very near future, there won't be oil enough to replace the demand that we have now. So then what happens? Peak brainiacs, yes, Scott. I'm with you, Osama, on that. I hate pre-shredded cheese. It's the worst. It also comes beautifully wrapped in plastic, otherwise known as oil. Let's see. Moving on. More shenanigans from the Trump administration, or Trump himself. Trump to nominate anti-environment extremist as permanent public lands chief. Oh, Lordy. William Perry Pendley says his personal views and past actions are irrelevant, quote unquote, when it comes to leading an agency that manages more than 1/3 of all federal land. Again, what could go wrong? President Donald Trump will formally nominate William Perry Pendley, a self-proclaimed sagebrush rebel. Along with titles that have the word skeptic in them. I also wonder about titles that have the word rebel in them, but it's a discussion for another time. With extreme anti-environmental views and a long history of advocating for the sale of federal lands in the West, to serve as director of the Bureau of Land Management. Pendley was tapped last July for a senior policy position at Bureau of Land Management, an agency of the Department of the Interior, and quickly elevated to acting chief. The backdoor appointment put him in charge of overseeing 254 million acres of public land, more than 10% of the entire U.S. landmass, and 700 million subsurface mineral acres. It also enraged environmentalists and sparked fears of a public lands sell-off. Well, yeah. The entire Trump administration has been one big public fear of land sell-off, right? Pendley, a native of Wyoming, is a former longtime president of Mountain States Legal Foundation, a conservative nonprofit that has pushed for the government to sell off millions of federal acres. He's written several books about Western land issues, which makes him an expert, including one titled Sagebrush Rebel, a reference to the Sagebrush Rebellion movement of the 1970s and 80s that sought to remove lands from federal control. In a January 2016 op-ed published by the National Review, he wrote, "Founding fathers intended all lands owned by the federal government to be sold." Did they? Did they? Did they? Not so fast, Captain Jack. The Trump administration has vowed not to dispose of public lands, yet it has cozied up to members of the pro-land transfer movement and tapped several opponents of federal land policy for high-ranking department positions. Pendley has dismissed concerns about his stance on federal lands and said his personal views in past statements, including some that describe climate science as junk science and comparing immigrants to cancer are irrelevant to leading a bureau. Are they? Are they? Are they? Oh, boy. Pendley also has ties to Lyndon LaRouche, the late cult leader, convicted fraudster and paranoid conspiracy theorist. Okay. He has ties to a conspiracy theorist. Well, don't we all? Don't we all? You know what I'm saying? So, more bad news, again, for the environment and the Trump administration's effect on the environment. It's been nothing but bad news. Violet Crumble says, I cannot stand Joe Biden, but I will vote for him. He is a dirtbag. Only cares about the corporate state. How is that so different from Donald? It isn't different. It really isn't different. And that is the problem. I would like to see Donald Trump go myself. So, you know, I don't have a problem with your stance at all, Violet Crumble. I think a lot of people want to see Donald Trump go. The thing is that if Biden wins and he gets into office, there's going to be an immediate push from the left against Biden. So Biden is not going to have a good time in office. I will be one of those people. I would like to see Trump go. Then I'd like to see, you know, if Biden gets in, I'd like to see Biden go. As quickly as Trump goes, I'd like to see Biden go. And then we need to actually make sure that we don't get left with this lesser of two evils decision again, right? We need to absolutely dismantle the corporate establishment Democratic Party. Nancy Pelosi has to go. Chuck Schumer has to go. You know, all the bought and sold Democrats that really just pass anything Trump wants, right? The resistance to no one, the resistance in name only. All those people need to go. But, you know, Trump needs to go quickly. Post haste. Immediately. But, you know, who knows? So, like, let's say Trump wins again. If Biden wins, Biden needs to go right away. If Trump wins again, maybe there's a massive push. You know, 20, 30 million people in front of the White House saying, like, out, Jack, and take Pence with you. Maybe we just oust him. Maybe we just oust him ourselves. Who knows? Right. Violet Crumble, exactly. Okay, let's get into the last thing I wanted to talk about today. And this is from David Wallace Wells in the New York Intelligencer. This is from today. Global warming is melting our sense of time. Ooh, that was pretty cool how it shrunk and got bigger. See that? Tricky. On June 20th, in the small Siberian town of Verkhoyansk, north of the Arctic Circle, a heat wave baking the region peaked at 38 degrees Celsius. Just over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the highest temperature ever recorded in the Arctic. In a world without climate change, this anomaly, one Danish meteorologist calculated, would be a 1 in 100,000 year event. Again, so, yeah, it's one of the things that deniers or skeptics or whatever you want to call them like to throw out there. Oh, yeah, it was this hot in 1915. Okay, well, your point is they're trying to say like, oh, this happens all the time. No, it's a 1 in 100,000 year event. Thanks to climate change, that year is now. If you saw this news last weekend, it was probably only a glimpse. So the one that happened in 1915 was supposed to be the 1 in 100,000 year event, right? But lo and behold, 100 years later, we've replicated such event. In only 100 years. Aren't humans awesome? If you saw this news last weekend, it was probably only a glimpse. Primetime network news didn't even cover it. No, did anybody hear about this on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News? Anybody? Anybody? If you did, I'd be curious if you all did. But the overwhelming, because I've only seen it on Twitter, literally on Twitter. I haven't seen this kind of anywhere else. Maybe I missed it. It might have been in the HuffPost, but I literally only saw this on Twitter. The overwhelming coverage of perhaps more immediately pressing events, global protests, global pandemic, economic calamity is only one reason for that climate occlusion. Right? So all kinds of other things going on. So maybe that's why they left this out. The extreme weather of the last few summers has already inured us to temperature anomalies like these, though we are only just at the beginning of the livable planet's transformation by climate change. A transformation whose end is not yet visible, if it ever will be, and in which departures from the historical record will grow only more dramatic and more disorienting, with more lethal almost by the year. At just 1.1 degrees Celsius of warning. Oh, crap. There's actually one other thing I wanted to cover. Just remembered. Anyways, at just 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming, where the planet is today, we have already evicted ourselves from the human climate niche and brought ourselves outside the range of global temperatures that enclose the entire history of human civilization. That history is roughly 10,000 years long, which means that in a stable climate, you would only expect to encounter an anomaly like this one if you ran the full lifespan of all recorded human history 10 times over, and even then would only encounter it once. You may register temperature records like these merely as a sign of a new normal, in which record-breaking heat waves fade out of newsworthiness and into routine. But the fact of those records doesn't mean only that change has arrived, because the records are not being set only once. In many cases, they are being set annually. The city of Houston, for instance, has been hit by 500-year storms in the last 5 years, right? And I believe we've covered most of those. And while the term has obviously lost some of its descriptive precision in a time of climate change, it's worth remembering what was originally meant to convey: a storm that had a 1 in 500 chance of arriving in any given year and could therefore be expected once in 5 centuries. How long is that time span? The natural historical context for a storm like that. 500 years ago, Europeans had not yet arrived on American shores, so we are talking about a storm that we would expect to hit just once in that entire history. The history of European settlement and genocide, of the war for independence and the building of a slave empire, of the end of that empire through civil war, of industrialization and Jim Crow and World War I and World War II, the Cold War and the age of American empire, civil rights and women's rights and gay rights at the end of the Cold War and the end of history. September 11th and 2008. One storm of this scale in all that time is what meteorological history tells us to expect. Houston has been hit by 5 of them in the last 5 years and may yet be hit with another this summer, which is already predicted to be a hurricane season of unusual intensity. Of course, that won't be the end of the transformations. Climate change will continue, and those records, high temperatures, historic rainfall, drought, and wind speed, and all the rest will continue to fall. From here, literally everything that follows climate-wise will be literally unprecedented. Looking at a bit of heat, land surface temperature anomalies. The Arctic numbers from June 20th are terrifying enough. With more context, they've become only more so. It was warmer than it was that same day in Miami, Florida. In fact, it was warmer north of the Arctic Circle than it has ever been on any June day in the entire recorded history of Miami, which has only once in the whole tropical century for which temperatures there have been registered reached 100. It was about 30 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in Verkhoyansk. Sorry, I'm just going to destroy that every time. Verkhoyansk, maybe that's it. Then the average high temperature in the region for June, which means the Arctic record was the equivalent in terms of temperature anomaly of a 110-degree June day in New York, which is super, super hot, or a 115-degree June day in Washington, D.C., which is almost deadly. According to preliminary satellite data, land surface temperature in parts of Arctic Siberia reached that level last week, too. 45 Celsius or 113 Fahrenheit in terms of temperature anomaly. That's the equivalent of a 130-degree day in D.C. on Capitol Hill. That would be very uncomfortable. Very comfortably lethal threat. Thankfully, for Americans at least, that isn't how global warming works. Its punishing effects are distributed unequally around the globe, and at the moment the Arctic is being punished most vindictively, warming at 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. In Siberia, in May, temperatures averaged as much as 10 degrees Celsius higher than normal. The arrival of the Arctic summer reignited zombie fires that had improbably burned through the Arctic winter, smoldering in peat rather than burning out. Those fires, like all fires, released carbon, which is stored in trees as surely as it is in coal. In this case, releasing as much CO2 in the last 18 months as had been produced by Siberian wildfires in the last 16 years. In early June, an industrial-scale oil storage facility there collapsed when the melting permafrost on which it had been built finally destabilized, releasing about 21,000 tons of oil and turning local rivers red. That spill was about 2/3 the scale of the Exxon Valdez spill, or Valdez if you want to pronounce it, even somewhat closely to how it should be, which horrified an entire generation. This one we've hardly read about, though it befell a far more ecologically degraded planet, with more than half of all carbon emissions ever produced by the burning of fossil fuels in the entire history of humanity coming since the Valdez spill. Perhaps, though, is a less precise word than because. The intervening generation of environmental calamity having quite thoroughly normalized horrors like these. Even Vladimir Putin, presiding over a petrostate which so far north actually stands to benefit from some amounts of global warming, declared it an emergency. All told, the planet's melting permafrost contains twice as much carbon as hangs in the planet's atmosphere today, and it's expected that over the course of the century, at least 100 billion tons of it will be released through melt. About 3 years' worth of global emissions, and functionally enough to close the window on the goals of the Paris Accord. That window was not open very far to begin with. One recent study suggested that even the decarbonization targets of Britain and Sweden, often hailed as global climate leaders, would produce emissions between 2 and 3 times the carbon budget required to meet the Paris goals. I was just talking about that yesterday, and we will talk about it again tomorrow, actually. Just taking a break for a second, guys. Please remember to like up the video. And if you are new here, please remember to subscribe to the channel. Poppy Davis, Putin's getting another 16 years. Because, he just keeps on getting elected. I mean, at least in Russia, they don't act like they have 2 different parties. Right? They whatever party Putin's a part of, that's the party that's going to get elected, right? They don't even feign that there's 2 parties that are neck and neck. Anyways, whatever. Going back to this story. They're talking about the Paris goals. Those are just their decarbonization plans, which are probably optimistic. Another analysis suggested that for all the talk of halving our emissions by 2030, as the IPCC says it's necessary to safely avoid 2 degrees of warming, and that's a knee slapper right there, the planet has only a 0.3% chance of doing so. 0.3% chance. So, we're We're doing good, guys. We're on track. Remember when Cory Morningstar was saying we're all on track? If Donald Trump won re-election, the analysis suggested, those chances would fall to 0.1%, 1 in 1,000. Yeah, if 2 degrees is now inevitable, that doesn't make it comfortable. I wonder what the projection of what the percentage chance if Biden wins re-election, because you know that Biden isn't going to do jack shit for the environment too. He just won't destroy the environment hand over fist the way that Donald Trump is, but he might stop all that. But what is he going to actually do for the environment? Jack shit. If 2 degrees is now inevitable, that doesn't make it comfortable. Indeed, it will be for much of the world a horror. And the space between those two things, inevitability and horror, is the one in which we will all be forced. That's a very, very good word, forced, to learn to live. So look, we're going to get there whether you believe it or not, or whether you agree to believe it or not, or whether you want to understand it or don't want to understand it, or want to avoid it or not. It doesn't really matter. It will happen. The inevitability of it will absolutely happen. So we will be forced to either do something about it or succumb. So, what's it going to be? That's really where it's at. There's all kinds of different scenarios about what humans will do when that inevitability shows up and knocks very loudly at the door. At 2 degrees, it is expected that more than 150 million additional people would die from the effects of pollution. Storms that used to arrive once every century would hit every single year, and that lands that are today home to 1.5 billion people would become literally uninhabitable, at least by the standards of human history. Those projections will invariably prove imprecise or perhaps worse. Maybe see Blade Runner. That's probably what life will look like if we're still living it like we're golden. The projections will invariably prove imprecise or perhaps worse. That is both the nature of science, which proceeds by revision, and humanity, which will likely adapt to at least some measure of these impacts. But the Siberian heat wave reminds us just how large the scale of necessary adaptation will likely be, requiring us to respond not just by shoring up the proverbial shorelines of our civilizations, but by preparing them in much more fundamental ways to endure conditions never seen before in the whole span of human history. It is also a reminder of just how much we miss when we regard the projections of any neat, linear model of future warming as a straightforward prediction of that future, and of what level of adaptation will be required, especially when we reflexively discount the uncertainty warning scientists invariably include, as any lay reader, including me, is likely to do. Perhaps the most important lesson of the freakish Siberian heat wave is, however terrifying you find projections of future warming, the actual experience of living on a heated planet will be considerably more unpredictable and disoriented. Hold on. How long is this? Oh, this is very long. Guys, I don't know how much longer I'm going to read this, because this is kind of a long article, but I think you guys get the idea. Not hard to find, though, if you'd like to read the rest of it. Just how freakish and unpredicted is this heat wave? Over the last few years, a growing chorus of critics have argued against one climate model built on predictions of high-end carbon emission in particular, called RCP 8.5, arguing that though it had been endorsed by the UN's IPCC and formed the basis of much recent science since the organization's last major report, its projections were simply implausible, relying, as they did, on the dramatic growth of coal use over the course of the century. As I've written before, that pathway does indeed look increasingly hard to credit as a model of our future, and is best understood in terms of emissions as an absolute worst-case scenario, which would require almost a global climate nihilism to achieve. But for those suggesting we should discard that model or any other that charted a high-end course for warming, the Arctic heat wave makes a very strong counter-argument. Because even in the worst-case pathway, 100-degree summer days in the Arctic do not become routine until the very end of the century. Yes, yes, yes. Going back to what I was saying the other day. These models that predicted that this would be the normal in 100 years or 80 years is now in 2020 pretty dang normal or getting close to it. So where does that put your model? Or, who wants to continue to believe this model? This heat wave is today an outlier. Is it? Not a routine event, but that doesn't make it irrelevant. Instead, it is giving us at least a brief preview of what the world would look like more than a half century from now. This is a ridiculous statement. I don't know how he actually fixed his pen to write this, but whatever. If you think this heat wave is just going to go away and then we won't experience it, or we might only experience it once in a while for the next 50 years until it becomes normal. Anyways. Instead, it is giving us at least a brief preview of what the world will look like more than half a century from now in a timeline we understand to be, at least in terms of emissions, impossibly pessimistic. But if our timeline could accommodate such extreme events from that worst case one, and decades ahead of schedule, it is also a sign that timeline is probably a misguided way of thinking about the new swirling universe of extreme events we are plunging headlong into. Making sense of climate change requires more than trying to determine where on a particular linear plot we are and where on it we are likely to be in 10 years. That's 10 years. Way more applicable than 50. It may require more profoundly revising our sense of linearity itself. In this way, global warming isn't just scrambling our sense of geography, with Verkhonysk, at least briefly, playing the role of Miami. It is also scrambling our sense of time. You may feel, because of the pandemic, that you are living to some degree in 1918. The Arctic temperatures of the past week suggest that at least part of the world is living simultaneously in 2098. But climate change isn't just a brutal form of time travel. It is discombobulating to our very sense of time when looking at projections for future warming. An event like the Siberian heat wave appears as an acceleration of history. But when looking at the paleoclimate record, it seems like a trip deep into the pre-human past towards eras like those, lasting millions of years, when palm trees dotted the Arctic and crocodiles walked in their shade there, especially at extreme levels. Warming threatens the apparent march of progress on which the modern Western timeline model of history was built. But at least until the arrival of large-scale carbon removal technologies, it also illustrates the fact that time in the form of carbon emissions, which hang in the atmosphere for centuries, is irreversible because we are doing so much damage so quickly, destabilizing the entire planet's climate. In the space of a few decades, warming can seem like a phenomena of the present. Seems like it, eh? It certainly seems like it. But its effects will unfurl for millennia, with the climate stabilizing perhaps only millions of years from now. Climate change unwinds history, melting ice frozen for many millennia and pushing rainforests like the Amazon closer to their long overgrown savanna states. It also makes new history, drawing new borders and new riverbeds, turning breadbaskets like the Mediterranean into deserts and opening up Arctic shipping routes to be contested by a new generation of great power military rivalries. It compresses history. Those Houston storms, for instance, represent more than a millennia of extreme weather, concentrated in a period of just 5 years, and it scrambles and scatters it too, disrupting the cycle of seasons and relocating rain belts and monsoons, among many other distortions. At the same time, temperatures in Verkhoyansk reached 100 degrees. In parts of Siberia, it was snowing. In other parts of Siberia, it was snowing. Was it winter or summer? A Russian catching the national weather forecast could have been forgiven for asking. They may have wondered, is this our hellish climate future or the return to the Little Ice Age? Contemplating the impacts of climate change from this perspective can seem naively abstract, and it is when compared to the storms and the wildfires and the droughts, not to mention the literal plague of locusts, 360 billion of them, which have devastated agriculture in East Africa and South Asia this year, descending in clouds so thick you couldn't see through the insects and leaving millions hungry. But in addition to its humanitarian cruelties, for instance, making pandemics like COVID-19 much more likely, warming is already recalibrating much more hard-headed models of time. 2. This is a sign that warming is truly the meta-narrative of our century, touching every aspect of our lives. Beyond the catastrophes and crises, the surreal and disorienting aspects of climate change are showing up even in the most numbingly pragmatic places, like, for instance, mortgages. Up and down the coastline, rising seas and climate change are transforming a fixture of American home ownership that dates back generations, the classic 30-year mortgage. Christopher Flavel of the New York Times reported June 19th, as it happens the day before the record-setting temperatures in the Arctic. As Kate McKinsey, I'm going to go back and say, when making pandemics like COVID-19 much more likely, it's interesting. I just wanted to remark on the fact that we thought that, apparently UV kills the virus, but the virus is actually taking off right now in the warmest parts of the U.S. So the idea that heat actually displaces or tamps down the virus has proven false. I don't know. Maybe it's exacerbating it on some level. Who knows? As Kate McKinsey has recently chronicled for Bloomberg, mortgages aren't the first or only financial instrument to feel the intrusion of a new climate reality much less forgiving and less stable than the one on which not just the financialization of the global economy, but indeed all of human civilization has been erected. Insurance and reinsurance, municipal bonds, and sovereign wealth funds, boutique hedge funds, and massive asset management operations are all beginning to reckon with a future made at least much rockier by climate change. How much rockier? Well, according to a Climate Central estimate, at least 500,000 American homes are on land expected 30 years from now to flood every single year. Ha ha. Altogether, those homes are today worth $241 billion. This is just homes, just in America. And annual flooding isn't the only flood risk a homeowner or a bank might want to consider, which means even looking only at flooding, many, many more homes are vulnerable than that. Of course, flooding is not by any stretch the only climate risk those homes and homeowners would face. Like many of those other financial instruments, a mortgage isn't just an instrument, but also a theory of time, a bet on future value built on the proposition that 3 decades is a long enough period to absorb the short-term turbulence of real estate markets, and a short enough period that larger systemic shocks would not have time to develop and reverberate. That is at least how mortgage looks from the bank side. From the consumer side, a mortgage represents a related but slightly different theory of time. For most of post-war American history, it has represented adulthood, as defined in mostly white and middle class and up terms. For all those distortions and delusions embedded in it, ideas about housing and the real estate market, but also race and class and urbanization and family structure, the 30-year mortgage also embedded an idea about the stability of society through time. That one could expect to arrive at the end of adulthood in a world recognizable to the person who began it, and indeed that whatever changes had transpired would be on net of value to the homeowner, who by virtue of his or her property had become a small-scale stakeholder in the prospects of the community, the region, the nation, and indeed the world as a whole. As the Times reports, both sides of that bargain are already now beginning to look very different. Home buyers are increasingly using mortgages to make it easier for them to stop making their monthly payments and walk away from the loan if the home floods or becomes unsellable or unlivable. More banks are getting buyers in coastal areas to make bigger down payments, often as much as 40% of the purchase price, up from the traditional 20%, a sign that lenders have awakened to climate dangers and want to put less of their own money at risk. And in one of the clearest signs that banks are worried about global warming, they are increasingly getting these mortgages off their own books by selling them to government-backed buyers like Fannie Mae, where taxpayers would be on the hook financially if any of the loans fail. One academic quoted, in the story, Jesse Kennan of Tulane painted the picture even more starkly. Conventional mortgages have survived many financial crises, he said, but they might not survive the climate crisis. As a divining rod of the future, the mortgage market is a crude tool focused only on a narrow set of values. When we know warming will affect many more, registering only a small set of changes and registering them only according to a purposely blinkered set of metrics. What the value of a property is, how it is likely to change, and what amount of risk is involved in making a bet on its worth and the reliability of mortgage holders to pay. Already, the terms are shifting to reflect new realities. A doubling of the required down payment reflecting a much higher sense of risk, but as McKenzie writes, more precise financial tools won't necessarily protect us from climate risks, only allow those utilizing them to profit from them, perhaps even in discriminatory ways. Well, perhaps, definitely in discriminatory ways. Presumably in the years ahead, banks will continue to modify their calculations so that the mortgage will survive, at least in some modified form, reflective of some additional climate risk, perhaps, depending on the place, quite a lot more risk, but surviving in what form exactly and making what claim about the stability of the near future and how comfortably we may all live in it. Time will tell. Hope you all enjoyed that. That was a bit of a long read, and thanks for hanging out with me. A little bit longer today. Yeah, I mean, he brings up a lot of good points, of course. David Wallace Wells, understanding the extreme emergency state of the climate. If not, slightly confused about the timeline, but I don't know. I don't know if he's just doing that to placate, placate people on some level. You don't want to scare the children again, whatever. Hey guys, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. You can also support the channel at the links below: PayPal, Square, and Patreon. Also, all of my live streams are available for listening on Patreon if you happen to miss them during the day. So you can sign up for my Patreon for as little as $1. If you want to go check out the live streams, they are all there. Thanks a lot.